You ever hear people on the news talking about the fiscal deficit, and you kind of just nod along, feeling like you're supposed to know what that means? Don't worry, you're not alone. Today, we're going to crack the code. We're going to translate the government's entire budget into something that actually makes sense. A simple family budget.
Right? This term is everywhere, especially when the budget is announced. It sounds super important, and you know what? It is. But what is this number that grabs all the headlines actually telling us about how the country is doing financially?
So to really get this, we're going to use one simple idea for this whole explainer. I want you to forget about the billions and trillions for a second and just picture the government's finances like the budget of one massive family.
Okay, first things first. Just like any family, a country's budget really comes down to two things: all the money coming in and all the money going out. Let's start with what the family's earning.
So, in our family analogy, this is the total household income for the year. For a government, we call this its revenue. It's all the cash it collects to keep the country up and running. But where does this money actually come from?
Well, it pretty much boils down to two main sources. First, you've got tax revenue. That's the money that comes from us, things like income tax or even the GST you pay when you buy a chocolate bar. And then there's non-tax revenue, which is money the government earns, like profits from companies it owns or the fee you pay to get a passport.
All right, that's the money coming in. Now for the other side of the equation, expenditure. This is just a fancy word for all the money the family, or in this case, the government spends. But, and this is a big but, not all spending is the same. And this slide lays out the difference perfectly. On one hand, you have revenue expenditure. Think of this as the family's daily and monthly bills, paying salaries, buying groceries, keeping the lights on. It's essential stuff, but it doesn't really build for the future. On the other hand, you have capital expenditure. Now, this is an investment. This is the family buying a new car or the government building a new highway. It's spending that creates assets that will pay off for years and years to come.
So you've got money coming in, money going out. Simple, right? But what happens when the family wants to spend more than it actually earns? Well, that's when we have to start talking about deficits. And this right here is the big one, the fiscal deficit. Put simply, it's the annual shortfall. It's the exact amount of new money the government has to go out and borrow in one single year, just to cover all of its spending. Let's bring our family back into the picture. Let's say they earned 80 rupees, but they want to spend 100 rupees to pay all their bills and buy that new car we were talking about. See that 20 rupee gap? That gap is the fiscal deficit. It's the money they have to borrow to both live and invest.
So you're probably thinking, okay, so borrowing is bad, right? And that's the key question. The answer is not necessarily. I mean, think about it. If the family borrows to buy a car that helps someone get a better job, that's a great investment. But if they're borrowing just to buy groceries every week, that could be a huge problem. And this is where we need to look at a couple other types of deficits.
Okay, so let's zoom in on just that day-to-day spending. A revenue deficit happens when the government's total income isn't even enough to cover its basic running costs, things like salaries, subsidies, and just keeping the lights on.
Back in our family house, this is a major red flag. This is like your monthly salary not being enough to cover rent and food. You're having to put groceries on a credit card not because you want something extra, but just to get by.
So let's be crystal clear here. Is a revenue deficit bad? Oh yeah, it's very bad. It means the country is basically living beyond its means day to day. You're borrowing just for consumption, not for investment. That kind of debt doesn't create any future growth, and it's a recipe for disaster down the line.
All right, now for our last type of deficit, and this one's actually pretty clever. The primary deficit tells us a lot about the spending habits of the government that's in charge right now. It answers a simple question. If we totally ignore the interest we have to pay on old loans from the past, how much are we borrowing for today's new expenses?
Okay, let's walk through this with our family. Say the family borrows 20 rupees this year. That's the fiscal deficit. But wait, 5 of those rupees have to be used immediately to pay the interest on some old loan that grandpa took out. So the primary deficit is just the leftover 15 rupees. This number tells you if the family is making the debt problem worse right now or if they're just stuck paying for the past.
Okay, so we have all these numbers, right? Deficits measured in thousands of crores. But a huge number by itself is kind of meaningless without any context. How do we know if a deficit is actually a big deal or if it's totally manageable?
And I love this slide because it makes the point perfectly. For a student, a 1 lakh rupee debt is a massive, stressful burden. But for a billionaire, it's literally pocket change. The size of the debt only makes sense when you compare it to the size of your income. And for a country, that income is what we call its gross domestic product, or GDP. It's the total value of everything the country produces in a year. So we measure all these deficits and the total debt as a percentage of GDP. That's how we know if the country can actually afford it.
So, what's a good number to look for? Well, for a big, growing economy like India, a fiscal deficit that's somewhere around 3 to 4% of GDP is usually considered a pretty healthy and sustainable target. It shows the government is probably borrowing for smart investments, but at a level that the economy can comfortably handle. And one last really important thing, don't mix up the deficit with the debt. The fiscal deficit is what you borrow this year. The government debt is the grand total of everything you've borrowed over all the years combined. Think of it like your total credit card balance that's been building up for a long, long time.
So we've unpacked all the jargon, but why does any of this really matter to you and me? Well, it matters because these numbers are how we hold our governments accountable. They make public promises and sometimes even pass laws to prove to us that they're managing the family budget responsibly. This table right here is fantastic. It's your cheat sheet. Let's run through it. The revenue deficit asks, are we borrowing just to survive? The goal should be 0. The fiscal deficit asks, how much do we need to borrow this year? We want that to be low and manageable. The primary deficit asks, is the current government making things worse? And the total debt, well, that just needs to be sustainable. And that brings us to the final thought. Governments set official targets for themselves, like India's FRBM Act, to try and manage all of this. But now, you don't have to just take their word for it. You actually have the tools to look at the numbers for yourself. So the next time you hear a politician talking about the deficit, you can ask the real question. Are they investing in our family's future, or are they just borrowing to keep the lights on?